Suzanne LaGrande, and today on We Are All in This Together, I am speaking with Laura Mucha, who lives in London. She is a lawyer turned poet and writer who has recently published Love Understood, The Science of Who, How, and Why We Love. So, Laura, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it is like in London.
We knew what was going on in Italy. So, you know, in the news, we had Italy, which was a couple of weeks or whatever ahead of us. And we weren't going into quarantine. And there was a lot of controversy, I think, of people and a lot of senior people in Italy going, London, you know, you've got the advantage of seeing how it's playing out with us. You need to go into lockdown, but we weren't going into lockdown. And so before the lockdown was announced, there was a kind of slow dwindling of people in public voluntarily. And there was also this kind of, you know, restaurants closing and pubs closing, and then eventually gyms and schools and nurseries closing. So I went for a swim every day until gyms closed in that week because I was finding the whole thing quite anxiety producing, and swimming was keeping me sane, and I was the only person in the swimming pool, and like the changing rooms were empty, so I felt like it was quite a safe thing to be doing. And I also would swim and think that maybe chlorine was killing any virus, so I felt kind of safe underwater somehow. And then the lockdown came, and it's been very interesting. The 2 days before the lockdown, I went for a cycle around London with my husband and son. And there was no one. Like at Buckingham Palace, it was us and two other people. So I have a photo of my husband and son and no one else in front of Buckingham Palace apart from these two people. We cycled around roads that normally are, you know, extraordinarily busy with cars and tourists, and there was no one. Oxford Street, empty, completely empty. Shaftesbury Avenue, I mean, Leicester Square, it just no one, just a couple of policemen on horses. I think they were actually policewomen. So that was really interesting and weird because we had to think in advance, you know, okay, have we got water? Have we got hand sanitizer? Do we have food? Because, you know, most of the restaurants, like almost all of them are closed. Like some of them were doing takeaway, but most weren't. And then we came and we went for that bike ride because we don't have a garden. So we live in a flat with no garden and we just wanted to kind of get out and have a bit of space. And then the lockdown came and it's been interesting to hear about this. So we haven't been out, but parks have now been closed because people weren't listening to instructions. So people have, because we've had quite nice weather, I think, you know, the Brits don't get very nice weather very often. So there's been nice weather and it sounds like people are like, yay, and going to the parks. And some of them you can understand, like people that don't have a garden and people with children and live in big tower blocks, it's important for them to get outside. But a lot of people have been getting outside and not complying with rules about how far you should stay away from people. So now they've shut the parks. It's all a bit bonkers, and things like online shopping. So we've been online shoppers for our food order for many years because we cycle everywhere, and cycling with loads of bags is a nightmare. So we just get online deliveries. And all of a sudden, like, I went on yesterday to try and add something to the order, and there were 128,000 people ahead of me in the queue just to log on, right? Like, no. So it's a bit bonkers. It feels funny because on the one hand, this like really scary stuff on the news about how the death rate is going up and up and up. And then on the other, on social media and on messages and emails and WhatsApp, there's all these hilarious videos of people around the UK like being very, very funny stuck at home, you know. So it's crazy. It feels to me like a city of juxtaposition. Do you know what I mean? Of fear and humour, of camaraderie and individualism, you know?
How have people connected or come together when they can't actually see each other face to face?
Well, I am hopefully doing, I mean, I have no idea if this is going to work or not, a live poetry workshop with parents and their children next week through a members club in London as part of their events program. And I think I like the idea of, having however many people staring back at me on a screen and trying to find a way to group write a poem digitally, when normally that's something I do at schools or in festivals with actual humans. And I think this is happening a lot, so in the world of publishing, everything's going digital. London Book Fair and Bologna Book Fair have been cancelled. They're like two of the biggest things in the calendar. And so all of a sudden, all these people are having meetings where they just have loads and loads of little square faces on their screen, which I think is a funny and a new way of doing things, and might make people realise just how much can be done digitally. So I think, there's an element of, okay, well, what were we doing before that we can do digitally in terms of a work context? In terms of a social context, there are some people who, so like the NHS asked for volunteers a couple of days ago, and they've had twice as many people as they needed volunteer. And there are some people whose jobs, like they can't do their jobs, right? So like people who are painter and decorators, for example, now no one wants them in their homes because they're going into lockdown, who have decided to spend their time delivering food to people who are forced to isolate and not leave their homes because they're vulnerable. And so there's a lot of really like positive stories about humanity. And also this thing that I don't know if you're getting in the States, but in Italy there was this thing started where everyone at, I think, 8 p.m. every day would stand on their balconies, because it seems that everyone in Italy has a balcony and no one in London has a balcony. And everyone would stand on their balcony and clap to thank the care workers and the carers. And we started it last night. So there are like lots of videos from around London of people just, there's not a single person on the street, but there's loads of clapping and cheering. And so I think that kind of camaraderie is lovely. And the sense that, I don't know, I think that it'll be interesting to see if this creates a long-term change in gratitude, because I think that there's a lot that we and people around the world take for granted that other generations and people in certain countries don't take for granted. So, my grandma was kicked, or my grandparents were kicked out of their home with a few minutes by the Russian army, and then spent time in labour camps and in refugee camps. And I didn't live through that, right? Like I heard about it and found it difficult to really comprehend, but it influenced the way she thought about life. Like she kept money in a little metal tin hidden under, somewhere that robbers wouldn't find. And I think we haven't lived, many of us haven't lived through anything like that. And I wonder how, depending on how long this goes on for and what the repercussions are, if this will change our outlook. I think she was always really, really thankful for healthcare and for living in a country that was safe, for having enough food to eat. She was thankful, always thankful for having enough food to eat. And, I've grown up with enough food to eat. And now, you have, if you want to get something online, you have to wait for 128,000 people. And obviously this is nothing compared to what she went through and what people around the world are going through. But I'm just interested to see if it creates any kind of lasting change. Because some of the things that we've really taken for granted, like if you need intensive care beds, they will be available. You can't take that for granted anymore, that if you need something, you can go to a shop and get it. Can't take that for granted. That you can see the people you love face to face. Nuh-uh. That you could leave your home. So I'm interested to see how it changes. Will people save more money? Will people value relationships more? Will people be more thankful? Will people donate more to charity? I don't know. Will people feel more responsible for each other?
We're also seeing the real cracks and inequalities in our society.
Oh, yeah.
The things that are not working and perhaps have never really worked. for you, are there particular things that you are noticing in terms of systems that really have fallen down because they were never stable to start out with?
Some of the things that have been I've been thinking about, because for the book I did so much research on relationships, I'm acutely aware of people who grow up with abusive parents or people who are in an abusive relationship. And something I'm very conscious of at the moment is being on lockdown means very different things to different people, you know? So if you have a loving family and a garden and you can afford to weather whatever the financial repercussions will be for you, then this is going to be very different to if you live in a tower block in a very, very small place in an abusive household. Because all of a sudden schools are closing, right? And people can't go to work. So very toxic home environments have the capacity to become infinitely more toxic because they no longer have the space that's created, or the safe havens of school or workplace, or the outlets of exercise. So that's something that definitely kind of weighs heavily on me. And I think it's different for us than for in the US because we have the NHS. But I've always been very conscious of having how thankful I am for free healthcare, because when I was really unwell and was hit by a car and I was bedbound for a couple of years and had cardiac arrest, I joined an online group with lots of people, and most of them were from the US, actually, were people who had chronic health conditions. And a lot of the people, and there was like loads of chat rooms and loads of like classes almost on how to pace yourself, like how to get yourself accustomed to this new life. And a lot of what was going on for people that lived in the US was not only did they have their health to deal with, but the costs of managing their health. And I always knew that I could go for appointments on the NHS for free. And I don't think I'd ever really appreciated quite how lucky I was to have that until I was part of that online group. And so I think that it's, in some ways, it's a bit of an equalizer, right? Because like all the private hospitals here that people normally pay loads of cash to get, you know, a private room or faster appointments, have given their beds over to the NHS at cost. So, you know, everyone will be getting, I imagine, the same treatment, bar possibly, you know, the Queen, if she has it, or maybe Boris Johnson, who knows. But I think that's a great equalizer in this country, but internationally, you know, some countries like your own don't have that. And so health comes with this additional pain and worry, which is finance, which I think is horrible. Like, I'm so thankful to know that if I'm unwell, I don't have to think that, as well as having lost loads of work because I'm a freelancer, that I would have to somehow find the money to pay for hospital care. That said, we may not have enough beds. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the news at the moment about there not being enough beds. So it may be the case that in London, doctors will have to make decisions about who lives and who dies. And that's pretty scary stuff.
You've done an extensive amount of research on love. I'm just curious how, looking at this situation and what is unfolding, do you have any insights or new insights about love?
Do you know what has been really interesting? My husband and I, we live in a flat, and we decided to move in with my mum when the lockdown, so that she wasn't on her own, so that she could help us with looking after our son, and also so that he could have a garden. And on our way here, as we'd like manically packed our belongings into a car in a few hours, driving in the middle of the night, he was like, "You know what the world needs right now? Loads more marriage counsellors." And I was like, "Thanks. Are you trying to tell me something about our relationship?" But I do think that he's got a point, right? Like, I think our relationships are sort of buffered by the amount of other things we have going on, you know, like our space from each other sometimes, and the ability to send children to school for a bit of respite. You know, suddenly if you put families in a confined space, and in London, sometimes that can be quite a small confined space because it's so expensive to live here, then, you know, problems are going to be exacerbated. But also, I interviewed a guy, a poet who was 95, and he'd been married for 65 years and 49 days until his wife died. And he talked about when they first got together, he had PTSD from the war. And he talked about how they would have arguments, and actually it was just him kind of almost recovering from PTSD. And the idea that, you know, you can have an argument in your relationship, but actually if you zoom out, it's not about your relationship, it's about whatever else is going on. I think I wouldn't be surprised if we did, you know, if we'd done measures, you know, 2 months ago and then a month ago and then every day, if we'd measured anxiety levels across the country, I'm pretty sure they will have gone up, right? Like the fact that so many people rushed out and bought as much loo roll as they could, although the fact that you can't get an online shop now, you know, maybe they were right to do that, but I think, yeah, this whole, like, there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that people are feeling a little bit anxious, and this is manifesting itself in some really hilarious videos and comedy and music, and that's brilliant and uplifting. But I think that kind of low-level anxiety will impact relationships massively. And then also, you know, in terms of attachment theory, so it's one of the biggest theories of human development in the last century, and the basic premise is that we're all very individual in the way that we are in relationships. So, you know, you might be more predisposed to being independent and withdrawing and idealizing self-sufficiency and not connecting with your emotions, or you might be more hypersensitive to threat and more needy and clingy, and then if you don't get that proximity, you might go into protest behavior, which is like angry, frustrated attempts to get close to your partner. The theory is that in times of threat, that attachment pattern can flare up. So, you know, this is a time of threat. And I mean, it remains to be seen whether, you know, this is not necessarily a relationship threat, but it might be, because you're worried about the health and survival of yourself and the people that you love and the world at large and your financial well-being and whether you can get food and everything else. So, you know, these kind of patterns that you have in your life might be exacerbated at this time. So someone who is very, very independent, generally might find themselves being hyper independent and not asking for help, or someone who is very sensitive to threats, so someone that has an anxious attachment pattern might find that they're very, very sensitive to threats or feeling very needy and clingy. The challenge is to try and zoom out and recognize what's going on, and also, I guess, to try and do whatever you can to help yourself stay grounded. And unfortunately for me, one of those things is exercise, which isn't that easy at the moment, given that swimming pools have closed.
What do you hope might come out of all of this?
When my heart stopped, I found it really helpful. I found it really clarifying that to understand that life was limited and that I would die and I didn't know when, and that I was really thankful for my health and for everything that I had and could experience. And I think that it's one thing, you know, someone could say to you, you should be thankful, you know, or you might die, but it's a very different thing to really fully understand it. And I hope that this will help people clarify, like, what they're doing, whether they're living their lives the way they want to be, you know, whether they're valuing, you know, if they value relationships, if they're spending enough time investing in those relationships, you know, like if they're working and they have the liberty to think about what they're working or what they might do in terms of career, whether that feels meaningful for them, you know, like just to kind of reassess life in the way that I did when I was, I mean, in a pretty similar way, like stuck at home and unable to leave for a really long time. Although I didn't have the news talking about the whole world going downhill. So I hope it will be clarifying, I guess, and encourage us to be thankful in the long term.
I am Suzanne LaGrande, and this is We Are All in This Together.